Hey folks, quick content warning before we get into it. The discussion in this video will heavily center around themes of death, grief, and necroviolence. Please mind your own well-being while watching, keep on loving, keep on fighting, and hold on. Christopher Allen Pelkey was born in December of 1983. He was a veteran and a devout Christian. Friends and family describe him as deeply caring and selfless, a lover of cats, a good man who touched many lives. And on November 13th, 2021, at the age of 37, he was killed. Gabriel Orcasitas, the man who shot Pelkey during a road rage incident, was apprehended by authorities, charged with murder, and eventually convicted. And normally, that's where a story like this would end, a life cut short, mourned by his community. But in May of 2025, Pelkey would appear in court to offer an impact statement at the sentencing of his own killer. A message of forgiveness.
Hello.
Except he didn't. Because, of course, he didn't.
Just to be clear for everyone seeing this, I am a version of Chris Pelkey recreated through AI that uses my picture and my voice profile. I would like to make my own impact statement to Gabriel Orcasitas, the man who shot me. It is a shame we encountered each other that day in those circumstances. In another life, we probably could have been friends. I believe in forgiveness and in God who forgives. I always have, and I still do. To my family and everyone that I've met along the way, it was a lot of fun. You know, I always had a lot of fun. Love each other because you never know how long you have.
The video played in that Arizona courtroom was an AI recreation of Pelkey, constructed from photos, videos, and voice recordings collected during the man's life. His words, a letter written by his sister. What Judge Todd Lang and all in attendance witnessed that day were not the final words of Pelkey spoken from beyond the grave. It was a reanimated corpse performing a script. Now, listen. I'm not someone with a great deal of faith in the American justice system. Shocker, I know. And hell, if Pelkey's loved ones genuinely believe in forgiveness, believe that's what he would have truly wanted, I respect it. They are, after all, the people most impacted. And I've long argued that punitive justice is a harmful and unproductive ideal, though I'll save the police and prison abolition ramble for another day. But there's something about this video that really deeply bothered me. And as a quick peek through its YouTube comment section reveals, I'm far from alone in that instinct. Watching the internet react to this case was interesting. Beyond the general air of disgust, a lot of the wider conversation around Pelkey's resurrection has focused on how and why this video was admitted into court in the first place, and fears regarding what precedent this could set for AI-generated testimony going forward, which are very valid and important conversations that have been talked to death by people much more qualified than I am. But this story gripped me for all the wrong reasons. I wasn't content to let disgust stay unnamed, and through all my investigation, I couldn't shake the sense that there was something deeper happening here. Something I couldn't put words to myself until recently. This feels like necroviolence. I'm Archivist, a VTuber and video essayist creating queer and leftist art from a version of Earth where everything is just slightly worse. And I should probably start defining terms. The discussion in this video is going to largely center around generative artificial intelligence, which is a surprisingly nebulous term to define, but you probably already have some sense of what I'm talking about. For the sake of having a definition to work with, generative AI are machine learning tools that use large collections of training data, often scraped off the internet without knowledge or consent, to generate new data in response to user input. Most commonly text in the case of large language models like ChatGPT, but also images, videos, and audio, like the technology used to resurrect Pelkey, or the AI-generated code currently ruining your social media website of choice. I bring this up largely because I do think there is importance in drawing a distinction between machine learning technology more broadly, which, while not immune to abuse, can have genuine useful applications across various fields, and the generative AI that has become so predominant in our conversations on the topic. Especially as companies are keen to slap the term AI on every new product they release for the sake of pleasing investors. Clarity is vital to adequately communicating what, why, and how we oppose these things. But for the sake of simplicity, when I use the term AI in this video, unless otherwise specified, I am discussing the latter. And for the sake of making my stance blatantly clear, generative AI and the capitalist interests that have allowed these dangerous technologies to fester, all while wasting resources, polluting marginalized communities, enabling terrifying new forms of surveillance, and feeding blatant misinformation to the general public. I could go on. The harms caused by generative AI run much deeper than the elimination of arts or its psychological impacts, in ways I'd argue the wider discourse is yet to fully capture. And I could easily rant for hours on the subject, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Today, I'm interested in necropolitics. I would not be surprised if you've never heard that word before. Death is often treated as a taboo subject, at least in the majority of Western cultures. Something rarely addressed outside of the specific context we've collectively deemed socially acceptable, much less when that death falls outside of our comfortable narratives, when it is particularly gruesome, or the victim is marginalized, or the harm is, and I want to strongly emphasize quotation marks on this one, deserved. And that very tendency is necropolitics in action. Necropolitics is, in the simplest of terms, the use of social and political power to dictate the ways we understand, discuss, and rationalize death. Without getting too heavily into the Foucault of it all, this is not an overt use of power. It is a silent, subconscious, but ever-pervasive process. Necropolitics is the tool by which states justify casualties in times of war. It is the systemic cheapening of the lives of marginalized groups. It is visible when the lives of disabled people become acceptable losses in the midst of a pandemic, or in what tragedies become mainstream news, or in the very nature of the death penalty. Necropolitics decides who gets to be grieved, and who doesn't. Which brings us back to necroviolence. That's the funny little term I referenced earlier. This can be a harder concept to grasp, I think. Definitions of necroviolence, at least those found outside of academic contexts, often center themselves around the physical desecration or mistreatment of a corpse, an opinion I think is bad and wrong. Don't mistake me here. The specific targeted abuse of corpses has been a political tool for as long as culture has existed. Think the theft or dismemberment of the body of a political leader, or the mass burial of war victims in unmarked graves. But it's very rarely about the body itself. The intention of necroviolence is to demoralize the living by dehumanizing the dead, most often through the disruption of ritual. In many ways, I'd argue necroviolence is the process by which necropolitics are put into action. Action that can be symbolic as much as it can be physical. It can mean the mass burial of bodies in unmarked graves, the outlawing of long-held funeral practices, or the misgendering of a trans person after death. And there's a growing body of academic study exploring this angle, one which reimagines necroviolence as something more abstract, as the denial of grief. And I will ask you to put a pin in that for now. I'll admit, Christopher Pelkey does not resemble the typical subject of a conversation about necroviolence. He is, by the majority of metrics, well within the dominant cultural norm of the United States, and his death, while unfortunate, was tragically mundane. Maybe I'm stretching definitions here, but I think there's something to be gained by looking at Pelkey and the wider use of generative AI through the framework that necropolitics provide. AI and its interactions with the dead bring forth questions about the ways we cope with loss, the ethics of immortality, and the rights we have over our digital information. Because this is about a hell of a lot more than one piece of AI-generated testimony. In an era of generative AI and the modern internet, what does it mean to die? And what does it mean to grieve? On October 12th, 2021, I lost a friend. I'd been living with her at the time. One day, she left to visit family, and she never came back. A few weeks would pass before the news reached us, delivered by a mutual friend. It was a sudden, unmomentous loss. I never found out what happened, and frankly, I never asked. Partially because of a language barrier that made communication with the family difficult. Partially because, in the midst of the situation, it never quite felt real. Time kept passing, in a way I can only describe as relentless. A few days later, her room in the space we shared was emptied out. All signs she had lived there, gone. It was almost like she had never existed at all. There were traces, of course, reminders I would slowly uncover over a period of months. A forgotten pan in our kitchen, a shared vacuum left in our common area, and a private Instagram account. For a few short nights, that Instagram became a subject of fixation for me. I found myself staying up far too late, scrolling through her years of posts, trying to commit the details of her face to memory, reading back every conversation we'd ever shared, until, in what I'm still not sure was a fit of grief or a messy bid for closure, I unfollowed the account. In the age of the internet, death has never been less meaningful. There's this oft-repeated saying that the things we post online are there forever. A notion meant to make kids think twice before they share embarrassing or inappropriate details on the internet to limited success. And while I take issues with the ways the internet's permanence is so frequently taken for granted, we'll come back to that later, there certainly is some truth to it. I think back to the many evenings of my life spent digging through the remains of abandoned websites, the digital homes and passion projects of the few who had both the know-how and the resources to bring life to an early web. I think back to the many digital archival projects I've seen come to completion, whether as a bystander or an active participant. I think back to her. Because about once a year or so, I find myself checking that Instagram account, even though the posts are now inaccessible to me and my memory of its contents has long faded, just to see if it's still there. And over 4 years later, it is. A digital corpse. Poetics aside, I don't think this is an experience I'm alone in. To have lost someone and to only meaningfully remember them digitally. I share this anecdote largely to illustrate how common such a thing has become. As our material lives have become inextricably linked to technology, inevitably so have our deaths. And as our usage of the internet has become more and more centralized around a handful of websites, companies, and providers, it has become, in many ways, a graveyard. The internet has thoroughly cemented its place in the ways we grieve. We post digital obituaries where friends and family can share their memories and griefs for anyone to read. I'll admit, I visited Pelkey's more than once while scripting this video. The COVID-19 pandemic saw the rise of Zoom funerals in an era where physical attendance was often impossible, a practice that has continued to stick around in the years since. And there is, of course, the data we leave behind. Social media accounts, chat histories, digital purchases, photos and videos, entire lives and identities half-lived online. In the academic sphere, we more often call these digital remains. But for the sake of the larger conversation I want to have, I've opted to use the imagery of the corpse here intentionally. None of this is inherently a problem, to be perfectly clear. People die every day, and humans have always sought new ways to honor our dead. That some of those methods would be mediated through our shared digital spaces was an inevitability. And as the internet grew in its scope and accessibility, it was similarly inevitable that we would leave records of ourselves behind. But as the years passed, we've had to face a difficult question. What do we do about digital corpses? Because chances are, you encounter digital corpses regularly, often without realizing it. It is incredibly difficult to estimate what amount of digital content belongs to the dead, especially when it's hard to identify when users are dead to begin with. But the answer is probably a lot more than you think, and it is a number that will only grow with time. There is no rulebook for the handling of digital corpses either, but there are those who seek to write one. Which brings us to Facebook. Because in 2009, faced with an ever-increasing number of deceased users, they decided to answer that question. The solution Facebook arrived at was a simple policy. one which by default memorializes the accounts of deceased users following proof of death, preventing further login while leaving it visible to friends and loved ones. And in doing so, Facebook established what might be the first digital afterlife. A digital afterlife is the continuation of one's digital presence, passively or actively, after death. This can encompass anything from the maintenance of online accounts to allowing for the inheritance of virtual assets to, well, we'll get to that. And this has always been a subject riddled with controversy. From day one, Facebook's choice to memorialize accounts left many users uneasy. It is one that I have mixed feelings about myself. Ultimately, any blanket standard on the handling of digital corpses is one that will come with complex ethical questions. There's something to be said about consent. Our digital footprints are not carefully constructed legacies. They are messy, incomplete impressions of a whole personhood. Can we really choose whether that is something to be preserved? And about control. Who is a company to decide where, when, and how we grieve? Do we even own our digital information to begin with? In an effort to ease these concerns, Facebook has made a number of modifications to their policy over the years, mostly by handing a greater level of control to users before they pass, and by offering families pathways towards having these digital memorials removed. It's far from a perfect solution, but it more or less set the standard for the decade to follow. There are currently estimated to be over 30 million deceased users on Facebook. And there will come a day when that number is larger than that of the living. The issue of digital corpses is one that would have needed to be answered eventually. And it is worth pointing out that we are constantly collectively inventing the rituals of digital grief in real time as our needs and conditions shift. That is the nature of ritual, to shift and change alongside us. But recently, I've been concerned about the direction our digital afterlives are taking. Because the advent of generative AI has posed a new, scarier question. What if you never had to say goodbye? I cannot be the only one constantly getting these AI chatbot ads. Genuinely, how are they getting away with this? Large language models are perhaps the most ubiquitous form of generative AI these days, and I'd argue they're also the most concerning. It increasingly feels like you can't do anything online without having a machine-generated block of text thrown in your face. We live in an era where people are actively turning to ChatGPT over traditional search engines, even after it's been shown time and time again to constantly propagate misinformation, a problem that is getting demonstrably worse with every version. But it's not like those search engines are all that reliable when they all have AI summaries built in, or when the results are cannibalized regurgitations themselves. And then there are the chatbots. The ones that people use to roleplay and vent and seek companionship. I promise this is relevant. I don't know when we became okay with replacing human connection with AI. Maybe it's the fault of the loneliness epidemic, or some residual impact of the COVID lockdowns, or, you know, the deep-seated isolation intentionally instilled in our culture by capitalist forces. But the first time I ever came face-to-face with an AI chatbot was on a website named Project December. Released in September of 2020 by independent game designer and programmer Jason Rohair, Project December was one of the first of its kind. A simple chatbot running on a borrowed beta testing credential for GPT-3, intended to construct brief conversations with users as a variety of pre-programmed characters, and even boasting the capacity to customize your own. And I know that sounds just like every other single chatbot haunting the modern internet, but I want to stress here how new generative AI was at this point in time. The large language model that Project December utilized, GPT-3, would not be fully available to developers for another year, with OpenAI delaying the public release due to, and I kid you not, concerns about safety, abuse, and misinformation. ChatGPT itself would not release until November of 2022, but Project December's legacy has much less to do with its status as one of the first publicly accessible AI-driven chatbots, and much more to do with someone else's story. that of Joshua Barbeau and the Jessica simulation. Joshua Barbeau was a 33-year-old freelance writer from Badford, Canada, when he discovered Project December. Initially, the website was a fun toy. This was a novel technology, something nearly unimaginable outside of science fiction at the time. It wasn't good, mind you, often disappointing in its results, lacking memory, and quick to ramble off into nonsense. But so long as the text was kept short and sweet, Project December could generate realistic conversations with, well, anyone. It took a week for the thought to occur that he could use Project December to simulate conversations with real people. See, 8 years prior, Joshua had lost his fiancée, Jessica, to a rare liver disease. I don't want to speculate too much on who Jessica was. I don't think that's my place. But you can tell in his every description that Joshua was deeply in love with her. In his own words,
Jessica was a passionate and talented visual artist with a sense of determination, unlike any I've seen before or since. She brute force taught herself to be ambidextrous just to prove that she could. And to the best of my recollection, whenever someone told her she couldn't do something, she did it. She had a sense of charisma that made it impossible not to fall in love with her and always brought smiles into every room. If her disease hadn't cut her life short, I'm sure she would have done amazing things.
And her death was devastating. It lingered, as loss tends to, through years of therapy and attempts to move on. But Project December had opened the door to a question that I think many of us who have suffered loss have asked ourselves. What if he could talk to her one last time? It was with that thought that Joshua built a chatbot of his own. Trained on bits and pieces of old text logs and vague details of her life, he named it Jessica. I am not interested in interrogating the details of Joshua's chat logs here. I don't think doing so adds anything of value to this discussion. Excerpts from his conversations can be easily found online if they interest you, many of which he shared publicly himself, and he has spoken openly on his thought process. It was his own writing on the subject that introduced me to Project December, well before generative AI became the prominent danger it is today, though I never ended up touching the site myself. I am also not here to condemn him. Not for this, anyway. I'll admit, I've struggled to blame people for the actions they take in the midst of grief. I've been criticized on occasion for having a tendency to be too empathetic and lenient in many regards, though I'd argue a desire to see the best in humanity is fundamental to my ideologies, and one worth holding on to. Regardless, the last thing I want to do here is attack Joshua, or hell, anyone who has attempted something similar, for what ultimately amounts to messy attempts at coping with difficult losses in a culture which so often relegates the bereaved into silence. Joshua Barbeau was far from the first person to dream of using technology to bring back the dead. But he may very well have been the first to bring that nightmare to life. And for the low price of $5, you could do the same. Because, yeah, Project December was a paid service. And while Jason Rohair's work did not begin with the intention of becoming a window to the dead, when Joshua shared screenshots of his conversations on Reddit, he opened that door. Project December was soon flooded with users hoping to replicate what he did, grieving people desperate to reconnect with their deceased loved ones. A year later, the website would rebrand to reflect its newfound audience, complete with the new tagline: Simulate the dead. And I hope I don't need to point out the inherently exploitative practice that is monetizing grief. As of writing, it is unclear whether Project December is still an active service. Jason Rohair has not publicly discussed it since 2024, and I'm not about to waste $5 to find out. Regardless of Project December's fate, many tech companies were quick to see the profit potential. And while I do not condemn Joshua, I will loudly condemn them. Recent years have seen an epidemic of AI-driven chatbots and avatars that explicitly market themselves as a cure to grief. Apps like Hereafter and Two-Way are dedicated to enabling users to recreate their dead loved ones via text logs, video, and audio recordings. They even encourage users to create digital avatars of themselves, so that their loved ones never have to say goodbye. They've become such a commonplace phenomenon that they've been given a name: Griefbots. And I think the very existence of these services is indicative of much larger problems in the ways we've come to understand death, loss, and grief themselves. In his public discussions on the Jessica simulation, Joshua has shared many of his own thoughts about the nature of grief, and about Western culture surrounding the grieving process, much of which I agree with.
Grief is a constant companion to those who lose someone. Your relationship with grief might change and evolve over time, but I don't think it ever goes away. Society has a really negative reaction to grief, with some good reasons. I mean, we're all afraid of death. We like to sweep these things under a rug, or hide them in the closet because they scare us. But that stunts the healing process. In many ways, we're more sheltered from death our whole lives now than we ever were. And I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I think he sums it up well. Grief is something felt in absence. Learning to cope with that absence is the core of healing, but the grief itself never leaves. It's not simple or linear or finite, no matter what any supposed stages of grief will have you believe. And as uncomfortable as the notion may be, that's okay. I would argue that it's beautiful. But we live in a culture that is deeply intolerant of discomfort. Escapism and consumerism have become the status quo in the midst of systems that aim to keep us constantly overwhelmed, exhausted, and isolated. In our attempts to avoid the things we fear, we've built a world in which we are distracted from the everyday reality of death, wherein we are not prepared for the pain that loss brings, wherein grief has shifted from being an act of the community to a weight carried by the individual, wherein we are expected to simply move on. There is no correct way to grieve. I want to be clear in that. But the very notion that grief is a thing to be cured, that it is a problem to be solved rather than a fundamental element of the human experience, is a recent invention. And Griefbots seek to sell themselves as the answer. They are, at their best, a band-aid solution to the immediate pain of loss, one which stunts our ability to process and heal. At their worst, they are an overt attempt to control when, where, and how we grieve. And to control grief is to become the guiding force behind necropolitics. That is the aim of the budding digital immortality industry. To sell the fantasy of a world without death. And in doing so, to commodify life itself. Have you ever wanted to live forever? I'll be honest, the desire for immortality is one I have never understood. I've found that I'm very content with the knowledge that I will someday die. I'm kind of surprised I've made it this far already, and I find some amount of purpose in that fact. But I can't ignore that a yearning for eternity sits at the center of many modern Western funerary practices. We embalm bodies in an effort to slow decay, bury them in expensive caskets to put a layer between them and the earth. These are material displays of a cultural obsession with preservation and with legacy. For clarity, I don't think that is in and of itself a bad thing, but it is the urge the digital immortality industry seeks to exploit. Companies selling the promise of eternal life long predate the modern generative AI boom. As far back as 2008, now-defunct tech company Intellitar launched Virtual Eternity, with the eventual aim of developing digital avatars indistinguishable from real human connection. Since 2010, LifeNaut has provided a space for the creation of mind files, collections of personal information, uploaded content, and DNA samples they suggest could someday be used to replicate one's consciousness, or even to grow a new body. In 2011, Ether9 promised digital AI counterparts that could continue working, posting, and connecting even when users aren't there, including after death. And as dystopic as these concepts are in isolation, I feel the need to point out that they are also literal nonsense. Even today, as much as tech bros may try to convince you otherwise, we have not achieved the singularity. ChatGPT is not conscious, it is a glorified predictive text machine, and no existing AI tool is capable of accurately capturing your personhood from a handful of videos or text logs. But these projects of the past speak to the tech industry's long-standing interest in solving the, quote, problem of death. That is not to say that the dangers posed by the digital immortality industry aren't worth concern. AI-driven griefbots continue to exploit the pain of the recently bereaved, and the promise of digital afterlives has only grown more insidious in its shape. Earlier, I discussed Facebook's profile memorialization policy. But what I failed to mention is that in December of last year, Meta was granted a patent outlining methods for utilizing large language models to simulate a user's social media activity after death. And while a spokesperson for Meta has stated the company does not currently plan to go forward with the concept, I don't exactly trust that to hold true. And this is especially scary as the government and tech giants continue to push legislation that further ties our real identities to our digital lives. Because these tech giants aren't just interested in selling immortality or curing grief. This is part of a larger movement, that of technofascism. Bear with me here. Technofascism describes the messy collision of tech culture, billionaire financial incentives, and right-wing authoritarian ideals. It is a growing system which seeks to devalue and de-skill workers, increase state surveillance, censor free speech, and ultimately control all elements of public life. And AI sits at its center. We see this in the barrage of digital censorship bills introduced in recent years, attempts to force ID verification across the internet under the guise of protecting kids, or in the implementation of AI-driven surveillance tech nationwide, or in, the President of the United States allowing Elon Musk to fire government employees, shut down agencies, and access citizens' private information at his own whim. Technocratic capitalist ideals and the spread of authoritarianism are not distinct problems. They are functioning in tandem. And I know that might all sound a tiny bit conspiratorial, but we're living in the same universe where Palantir, the AI government surveillance company currently supplying the IDF and aiding ICE, has written and released a Silicon Valley manifesto. Controlling necropolitics is just a piece of that larger project. I spoke briefly in the first few minutes of this video about necroviolence as a disruption of ritual. Because ultimately, mortuary rituals are just the culturally constructed means by which we comfort ourselves in times of loss. They offer us a sense of control in the face of uncertainty, that so long as we play our part, our loved ones will rest peacefully. They offer us a space to safely process grief. To perpetuate necroviolence is to deny this grief. Rituals are not static, nor are they universal. They are practices that shift and change gradually alongside our needs and values. But in building virtual afterlives, the digital immortality industry aims to reinvent the means by which we understand and navigate loss in ways that circumvent the need for grief entirely, in ways that leave us dependent on them. And I would argue that itself is an act of necroviolence. And here's the thing. There is no such thing as forever. I've been dancing around this issue for the entire video. The ever-pervasive falsehood that our digital data is eternal has haunted me for much of my life. Over 24 years, I've watched many of the apps and social networks that defined my early experience of the internet disappear without a trace. I've watched close friends delete accounts, never to be heard from again. I've seen incredibly impactful pieces of art go missing. Digital archival is a deeply held passion of mine, and I know intimately well how easy it is for things to be lost. The digital immortality industry is keen on selling you the promise of eternity, but their own track record is clear enough to break that illusion. Intellitar, the company who first promised digital avatars all the way back in 2008, they shut down in 2012 following legal disputes. LifeNaut and Eater9 may still have semi-functional websites, but they've been seemingly abandoned by their creators for a few years now. And already, we are watching the AI bubble of the last few years start to crack, as companies realize that this technology is not profitable. And then, there's the data we leave behind. Digital corpses do not decay. Not in the way bodies do. There are no scavengers to feast on the remains, no insects to lay their eggs, no fungi to take root. Digital corpses do not rot. But just as a casket can only prevent decay for so long, hardware dies, files corrupt, and companies fall. The desire for immortality is one I have never understood. But to those who carry it, I want to make this much clear. That is not a goal that will be achieved by handing the means of our life, death, and personhood to a company. It will not be found in handing over ownership of our digital corpses. And it will not be found in generative AI. If I can be honest, I don't know where we go from here. But I do have thoughts. I am often frustrated with the focus many efforts at resisting generative AI have on regulation, as though the environmental, economic, and social harms of this technology can be successfully mitigated by asking the companies profiting off of them to play nice, though that may just be the anarchist in me talking. Regardless, it is extremely evident that the current state of digital privacy and ownership rights are not equipped to handle the crisis that AI has created. And there is increasing interest around the country in forging protections against AI reanimation specifically, a right to be left dead. We are not going to regulate our way out of this mess. Efforts to do so are ultimately a band-aid over a gaping wound. But it's a place to start. I'm not content to wait for the AI bubble's inevitable pop either. I'm of the mind that real change doesn't come without some amount of disruption. And listen, there's only so much I can safely say about the means of direct action against the tech giants propagating these dangerous technologies, but if I can offer any advice in that direction, find the leftists in your community and get loud. I think, ultimately, the rise of griefbots and the larger digital immortality industry are indicative of a deeply unhealthy culture around death and loss, and also of technofascism and the capitalist desire to commodify every element of our lives, but that's besides the point. We have the power to challenge existing constructions of death and grief, both our own avoidance of it and our internalized necropolitical frameworks, and I would encourage you to do so. We are inventing the rituals of digital grief in real time. We can choose not to hide from these things. And as uncomfortable as the notion can be, I think it's incredibly important that we have plans for ourselves when we die, both for our physical bodies and belongings, and for our digital lives. I first wrote a will at the age of 20. I treat it as a living document, something I've updated many times in the years since. I've also thought a lot about what happens to me after I die. And given abandoning my body in the woods for the scavengers to eat is illegal in most of the world, I'd like a natural burial. As for my online presence, I hope the media I've created lives on as my legacy until the day some outdated dependency or shutdown renders them obsolete. And I kindly ask that you let me stay dead. Holy shit, it's finally over. This project took far too long to complete. It has been about 11 months since my last long-form upload, and I want to apologize for the many delays and broken promises in that time. I have a habit of biting off more than I can chew, and while I absolutely have not learned my lesson, I am working towards making regular video production something realistic and feasible between my busy schedule and limitations as a disabled person. I also got FBI investigated. That didn't help. This has been a bold departure from the subject matter that garnered much of my audience in the first place, but I always plan to talk about a lot more than just being trans. Punk culture and leftist activism are core elements of my life, and I have so much to say. The next video will be a trans one, though, I promise. If you'd like to hear more from me in the meantime, you can find me yapping over on Twitch most Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays at 7 PM EST. I am predominantly a Twitch streamer, and I recently celebrated 4 years as a VTuber, which is like really cool actually. Don't forget to check out the Blue Sky and Discord while you're at it. Those are great places to keep up with me and my everything. Thank you to my good friend Retro VTuber for lending his voice to this project. A massive thanks as well to my singular YouTube member, August Russ, because that's apparently a thing we have now. And thank you for watching. I've been AE, signing off from the archive. Fuck generative AI.